Thanks, everybody, for joining us tonight. My name is Allie. I am a lead in South Bay YIMBY. We cover from Gilroy all the way up to Palo Alto, do a little crossover with Peninsula for everyone. But thank you again for joining us tonight for Beyond Towers and Sprawl. We're really excited to have Karen from Opticos Design joining us tonight for this discussion about missing middle housing. Alex Lee is going to be our moderator tonight. Very excited for him to be joining us as well. He's currently running for Assembly District 25, which covers North San Jose, Milpitas, Newark, part of Fremont, and part of Santa Clara, which are all places that could use some missing middle housing. And thank you to Urban Environmentalists and East Bay for Everyone for co-sponsoring this event tonight. All of our organizations are all working towards making our cities better for everyone by making them more inclusive and more walkable and designed around people first and not cars. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Alex to start our conversation with Karen.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me tonight, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel or to talk tonight about this topic. So as Ali mentioned, my name is Alex Lee. I'm the Democratic candidate for Assembly District 25, which encompasses parts of the East and the South Bay. Housing is central theme of my campaign, and I think doubly so now, especially with the recession that's coming and going to be affecting a lot of Californian families. I'm proud to be supported by South Bay YIMBY as well as California YIMBY, because I do believe that we need to be very energetic and use as many solutions as possible to tackle a housing crisis that's much afflicting the Bay Area, but of course the entire state. And one topic that I'm always very interested in, and you hear a lot about probably, is about the missing middle. How do you provide affordable housing options to people, especially in the middle rung, right? And so I'm really happy to have Karen on today, because I actually have a lot of great questions too, and I want to learn more about this subject and figure out how in Sacramento we can be actually achieve this and make sure there are more options for people. So I understand that Karen will have a short presentation which will illustrate a lot of these concepts, but throughout tonight, if there are any questions in the chat, you feel free to leave it in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you'd rather do it by voice. But I'll always be keeping check of the chat, but I'll also have a ton of questions, I'm sure, as well myself. So without further ado, Karen, you're an expert, so take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Alex, and thank you to Ali and to Zach and all of the Urban Environmentalists and East Bay for Everyone and South Bay YIMBY for having me today. I'm super excited to be here tonight, I guess. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started, show you some pictures. All right. Is that, Alex, can you see that okay? Is that showing now? Okay, great. All right. So as Alex mentioned, and as Ali mentioned, we all know there's an affordable housing problem and an attainable housing problem, right? We need that by 2025, over 15 million households in the country will devote more than half of their income to rent. And the problem just seems to be growing every time we look at it. So we know these are the problems. There are additional problems that we're facing, which is a desire for more housing choice. The reality is, for the past 75 years, we've built 3 housing products: detached single family homes, an apartment and a mid-rise or high-rise apartment building, and townhomes. 3 products for our incredibly diverse nation and incredibly diverse population and household types and all of these different things. And one of the things you look at is so much of what we've built is detached single family homes, but by 2025, in less than 5 years, only 25% of households will have households with children. And when you think about what the product of the detached single family home was built for, it was mostly built for families with children, and less than 25% of our population is going to be that household type. There's also an increasing desire over the past 20 years for walkable neighborhood living. And I think increasingly people are looking to be able to walk in their life. It's great health benefits. It has great mental health benefits. It is more responsible land use, that we're building more housing on less land. It supports transit, it supports local business. All of these are really important. But I think one of the big disconnects is that when a lot of these reports come out about the call for walkable living, too many people interpret that as people want to live in cities. And what we've seen with a lot of the pushback around a lot of this, the legislation that's trying to be passed and a lot of the changes that are happening is that a lot of people are resistant to the city living. And what we have to remind people is that it's not just city living or country living, that there's this middle ground, or suburban living, that there's this middle ground of neighborhood living that actually meets a lot of needs and is also responsible land use, it's responsible, fiscally responsible, and there's lots of other great reasons for it. So we talk a lot about reframing the housing conversation and talking about different solutions that are available that actually meet a lot of different people's needs. And so my partner, Dan Parolek, came up with the term of missing middle housing to describe this mix of building types that exist between the spectrum of detached single family homes on the left and mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings on the right. So everything from duplexes to triplexes, fourplexes, courtyard apartment buildings, bungalow apartments, townhouses, multiplexes, and live work units. And the names will vary depending on what region you're in the country. 3 flats, you know, there's lots of different language changes, but essentially what we're talking about is house scale buildings, usually 2 to 2.5 stories with multiple units in them in walkable neighborhoods. It's really very simple. And these housing types exist in every pre-1940s neighborhood across the country. Everywhere we go, we find these. So I'm going to show you some examples. A duplex, 2 units side by side. They can also be stacked. Cottage courts, and this is one of my favorite housing types. I joke, only half jokingly, actually growing up, raising my children, that this is my favorite housing type because I dream that I live in one of these apartments and that my babysitter lives right across the courtyard in another apartment. But it actually resonates with a lot of us that live far away from extended family now and actually need more communities around us to help support us with childcare and living. Fourplexes. This is a wonderful building. This is actually in Dallas, Texas. And what I love about this building is that this looks like it could be a single family home, easily be a detached single family home. This building actually has 4 units in it. It's a fourplex. And the building in the background with the yellow brick actually looks exactly the same from the outside. And it actually has 8 units in it. So it talks about this idea that from the outside, it still looks and feels like the walkable neighborhood that everyone is looking for, that many people are looking for, but you can actually have multiple size units and multiple families living in it. Small multiplexes, 6 to 8 units. And a courtyard apartment building. This is a courtyard apartment building that we found in Sacramento. And this actually, the average unit size in this is 588 square feet, which is nice for a single person living. In fact, it's the size apartment I lived when I was married for the first 3 years with my husband. And it actually generates over 150 dwelling units per acre, this project is. And we'll talk about that more later in the questions. But typical detached single family home is somewhere from 4 to 8 dwelling units per acre. So we're talking 10, 15 times the density. It exists across the country, as I mentioned. Here's some examples in Denver, Detroit, Sacramento, and here in the East Bay in Oakland. And the great thing about missing middle housing is it can be distributed in lots of ways. We have diagrams on our website that show multiple different ways, but here's 2. One is it's just distributed throughout detached single family homes. So in this diagram, the white buildings are detached single family homes and the yellow buildings are missing middle housing. And as you can see, it fits right in the neighborhood. And that's typically historically how it was built. In addition, these can be great building types for transitioning. So if you're having resistance in your community to larger apartment buildings being built on the corridor, or there's Main Street uses going on, these housing types are actually often much more forgiving for that transition, and they enable a transition from the detached single family home into missing middle housing and then into the higher intensity corridors. And they're also actually more affordable by design. And so when we talk about affordable housing solutions, we often hear about the barbell of affordable housing. And on one end, some people say it's just a supply and demand problem, which it actually is. We really need more supply of housing. And because there's not enough supply and a high demand for housing, the prices are very high. And so the more housing that we can build, the more it's going to bring down the price of housing. On the other hand, people talk about, well, we need to subsidize housing, and that's true too. The cost of building these days is astronomical, and it's really difficult to actually build something that many families can afford to live on. But if you look at these 2 buildings, what's being built as subsidized housing and what's being built at market rate housing, they actually look the same. And most of those solutions are looking at mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings. And where missing middle housing comes in is that they can actually be built into these detached single family neighborhoods, but they're more affordable by design because it's the same land price as a detached single family home, but it's now being shared by multiple units. So that land cost is being split in 2 for a duplex, or it's being split in 8 for an eightplex. So the cost per unit of land is lower, and especially in places like here in California and many centers in the country, those land costs are significant. There's also lower construction costs than multifamily housing because it's all stick-built wood frame construction. So you don't have the construction costs of having to build a concrete podium. So the construction costs are simpler. The units are by definition smaller, and so you're actually paying for less square footage. So the cost of a unit is going to be lower. Not all of us need to live in 2,500 square foot houses. And then also, this is a great opportunity for local and incremental development. So small incremental developers, local developers can actually I consider it the house flipping community, the development community that's been flipping houses for the past 20, 30, 40 years is the perfect group of developers to be building missing middle housing at this small scale. And I hear a lot that people are saying, well, that doesn't mean it's going to be capital A, quote, affordable housing. And it's not. This is not subsidized housing, but it is going to be less expensive than detached single family housing for all of these reasons. And so what it's doing is providing more options at lower costs than what we have currently at market rate, but it's a market rate solution, so it's not subsidized. And we like to call it attainable to not get confused with capital A affordable subsidized housing. So why aren't we building it? Well, it's been zoning has prohibited it since about the 1940s, depending on when it came in. So by definition, a single family zone does not allow anything but detached single family housing. A lack of financing in the finance market has been built around what they can have comps for and what they have proven is built. And since we haven't been building it, there aren't comps for it, and there's not a financing mechanism to finance these types of buildings. Community resistance, the worry about density, multifamily and upzoning. These words are scary to people because of what they envision when they hear that. When they hear the word density, they think Manhattan, and you will hear stories all over, but I don't want Manhattan in my town. It's because of what they see, and that's why we always show pictures, because this is what people see when they think density. Untested markets, because we haven't built this mostly since the 1940s. The markets are still untested, although increasingly that's less the case. And building at an efficient scale takes some thinking. How do we build small in the house flipping community? How do we build efficiently? So one of the things that we do to address this concern, particularly the worry, is we lead walking tours. And so we do walking tours. We've done neighborhoods all over the country, and we just go out and we talk with people and we show them that missing middle housing usually already exists in their neighborhoods, and certainly in a lot of the walkable neighborhoods, historic, that they love, and talk with them about how these housing types have always been integrated into these neighborhoods and how they make great places for people to live. So one of the problems, as I mentioned, was the zoning and ineffective regulations. And this is something I wanted to mention. So some people, when they say density and multifamily, they think of mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings, and some people don't want that. But other people think of this. They think of this 70s apartment building. And I laugh because I have stories of when my husband and I moved to Berkeley, and all we wanted was a little garage ADU that had been converted into apartment. And every apartment that we stopped at in Berkeley looked like this. And we were horrified. This is not where we want to live. Right, but this is what happened often in the 70s when multifamily did start to be allowed, and then there was a whole nother backlash against this, and that's when single family zoning took off again. And so we need to be careful that this is not necessarily what people want. But the reality is that we can have this instead, the Dallas example we can have instead, but we have to regulate differently, and zoning has to be able to tell the difference. And so being careful and about how we zone, and in particular, we usually recommend using form-based codes to make sure that what we're doing is we're defining the size that the building can be, the width, the depth, and the height that the building can be, but then we don't regulate the density. We don't regulate the number of units in it. And so being really careful about the zoning is important. And I just wanted to show this quick study that we did on a lot up in Novato in the North Bay, and it was a 50 by 150 foot lot. And this was allowed by zoning. A 35-foot single family home was allowed by zoning. This is a 3-unit building that was allowed by the general plan. It wasn't yet allowed by the zoning, but was allowed by the general plan. But this wasn't allowed. It has more units. It's more compatible with the neighborhood, is more affordable, but it's not allowed by the zoning. And so this is what we're trying to change. So just to give you some examples, these are some projects. This is a project that we designed in Salt Lake City, Muse Homes, and it's on the inside of a block where the alley typically would be, and we designed it as a pedestrian walkway. And one of the great things about this, the #1 buyer of this type of unit is single professional women that are looking for more affordable places to live, but they want the community that comes with it, and they want the safety that comes with it. This is a neighborhood that is being built outside of Omaha, Nebraska, and the entire neighborhood is missing middle housing. There's no detached single family housing in the neighborhood. And there's some great stories about this where a woman has moved in and she's living in an apartment that's I think it's $500. Well, I don't remember the exact rental price, but her neighbor is a doctor that works at a local hospital, and she's paying 1/6 of what he's paying in rent. And she talks about living in the neighborhood, and this is the first neighborhood she's ever lived in where she wasn't trying to get out of the neighborhood, that she could actually afford to live here at the low rent that she could afford to pay. And she actually loved living in the neighborhood. She wasn't surrounded by so much distressed housing that she was trying to escape the neighborhood. And I think that's another option that missing middle housing shows, is that you can have these different price points and have people of all different income levels living in the same neighborhood. This is a car-free community that we are designing in Tempe, Arizona. And this is the largest car-free community in the United States that's being designed. And it's all a combination of buildings that are essentially 4 to 6 units per building. And I have some pictures we can talk about later in the question and answer, but this is an exciting option. It's right across the street from a transit station. And all of the walkways are pedestrian, bike, and micromobility only. There's no cars allowed. And then this is a design that our firm did just to show the possibilities. This is the North Berkeley BART station, for those of you familiar with Berkeley in the East Bay. And this is a BART station that's actually in a completely low-rise neighborhood. It's detached single-family homes and missing middle housing in it, because it's a pre-1940s neighborhood. So that's surrounded by detached single-family homes and duplexes and fourplexes. And BART is allowed to build up to 7 stories here now by state law. And what we were trying to show is that we could actually achieve the density that BART's asking for, which I think is somewhere in the 70s. I don't remember exactly. We were actually able to achieve 92 dwelling units per acre, exceeding BART's requirement for, and the state law requirement for density, without actually building up to 7 stories, and being able to build lower around the edges on the streets that face the 1 and 2 story housing, and then building a little bit taller, but only up to 4 stories along the central spine. So these are just some ideas that show you the possibilities. And just so you know, there's a new book out. I have it here too. My partner's book just came out in July, so we're super excited about that. And there's some great examples. So I'm going to stop there because we were trying to focus mostly on Q&A, but I wanted to give you all some images to think about so you know what we're talking about, and some framing for the conversation. So I'm going to stop my share.
Awesome.
And then Alex, we can go from there. Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kara, for that. It's so illuminating. I love it. I'm a big visual learner myself, and I can't tell you how many times I've actually seen the gradient of a housing kind of picture before. So I didn't know that you all made it. So that's really awesome. Yeah. So it's really great to see all the examples, and because a lot of times we talk about missing middle, we talk about these concepts, but when we see it, then we go, a lot of times, oh, wow, I've seen that before in my neighborhood. I've seen something like that. It's existed. Exactly. And I could say, in the many times that we've knocked on so many doors, I've come from, a typical detached single family neighborhood. And then one street over, you have something that's more historical missing middle like that. So, that kind of begs the question is, and you kind of touched upon this in your slides, but, historically, these were much, much more common. They weren't obviously having the name missing middle, but what kind of changed? Why is it that even though there's that precedent where older folks, I'm sure, have a precedent, a memory of living in these units, but now have such disdain for them? Why have we turned away from missing middle housing?
A lot of it had to do with zoning and our history of zoning in the United States. And so, zoning is actually only a little over 100 years old. First zoning codes were written in New York City and Berkeley, California, again, in Berkeley, in 1916. So as zoning was proliferating, there was actually a huge push from the federal government to proliferate zoning as a way to segregate neighborhoods and to actually create single family zoning in order to create areas where only white folks could live. And the idea there was that it was paired with different housing programs for the mortgage programs and who could get mortgages. And so by zoning areas that could only be detached single family homes, and by pairing that with programs where only white folks could get a mortgage, it by definition made those areas white only. And so there's that history of our zoning. And it's unfortunate because prior to that, a lot of Irish immigrants, and, you look at the history of cities like Chicago and, European immigrants and, immigrants who built our country were all living like in 2 flats and 4 flats in Chicago. And they often used them as a way to build wealth. So they would actually build a 2 flat in Chicago. They would live in one unit and they would rent the other unit to other immigrants in order to build wealth in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. And so it really became unfortunate when detached single family homes became associated with kind of white prestigious living, because the reality is we had this rich history of these housing types, of these missing middle housing types that actually helped us make our country. But so when zoning proliferated and these detached single family zone only came about, then there was essentially single family zones where the detached single family zones went. And then there was multifamily zones. And what happens in multifamily zones is developers max out what they can build. And so they started building taller buildings because they could. And so the finances, if you can build bigger, if you can build bigger buildings, then the finances of building a smaller multi-unit building doesn't make any sense because you really are trying to max out your land. And so these building types weren't allowed in single family zoning. They didn't make fiscal sense in multifamily zones. And so they just fell out of being designed. And then all the other systems, like I mentioned, the banking systems all fell into place behind it. And people forgot how to build these. People couldn't get financing for them. And so we're just no longer building them.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm so glad you highlighted those facts because, land use, I think, often gets left out of the talk about racial inequalities, and how we have in this country decided to say who can live where or who can do what in these pieces of land has so much to do with how the inequalities are so deeply ingrained today. Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought that up of how basically over the last 50 years, we've completely changed up how society is just by those small little tweaks, right? Very deliberate tweaks though. But like today, there is a big sentiment in favor of detached single family home living that has manifested for a lot of different reasons, but it even percolates, to more, I guess, benign mindsets where it's like, well, people just get so used to having, like they only think they can be comfortable. They have a big space, a parking garage, a backyard. So when people say they need all those things to live, what do you say to people who think that way?
We talk about a lot of things. First of all, this is about housing choice, right? There is actually a proliferation of detached single family housing in the United States. And some studies have shown we've already built enough detached single family homes to meet the demand for the next 15 to 20 years. So that is always available and will be available to people. What we're trying to do is offer other choices. And and so a lot of people are asking for walkable living. They want to be able to live in a place where they can walk to the market, where they can walk their kids to school, where they can walk to a movie theater or restaurant. Again, post-COVID world, although I would like to talk about the COVID aspects, the pandemic aspects of missing middle housing, but the idea of walkable living has actually become really attractive to the vast majority of Americans. In fact, something like over 60% of Americans have now said that they would prefer to live in walkable neighborhoods. But there's a math issue there, right? In order to have a local business to walk to, that local business has to be viable. There have to be enough people within walking distance to support that business. And you can't do that with detached single family home. It's supporting local businesses, supporting transit, supporting all of these, supporting, enough schools. These things don't work unless you actually have enough people living within walking distance. And so you need to have more people within walking distance. And this missing middle housing provides a way to do that. It provides a way to fit more families in, and yet still have it in that low rise. You can have tree-lined streets, have backyards, all of this space that people are still looking for. And so that's one of the things we talk about. The other thing is that part of that trade-off too is that you have to choose to use that land within the walking radius of the churches and the local businesses and the transit stops for housing rather than for cars. And so you're talking about a trade-off. Well, but if you're able to walk places, then you actually don't need your car as much. And so I live in a family of 4. We have 2 kids. My husband and I have 2 kids. And my daughter is now turning 18. I can't believe it. And we've only ever had 1 car. We've always lived with 1 car because the 2 of us ride our bikes to work. Our kids ride their bikes to school. And now my daughter takes the public bus to school. We've always been able to walk or bike or take transit for all of our daily needs. And so we have 1 car that we typically use just for going out of town because we live in California. There's a lot of great places to go. And so it's very possible. And we love those trade-offs. We would rather have a smaller yard. We would rather have one less car to pay for and maintain, and get to ride our bike. And we get to be out in the neighborhood. We get to see people and talk to people while we're commuting to work or commuting to school. Our kids have more independence. They're learning how to live independently. So there's these trade-offs. And not to mention the trade-off I talked about with the courtyard living, like the idea of living in a 4-plex or a bungalow court where there's, 2 or 4 families that are sharing a yard. In many families, that's, in many cultures, multi-generational living always had that, right? You have 3 generations living in the same house and in the same yard. And the idea that you have multiple families helping look out for the kids is actually something that a lot of families are looking for. I would have loved to have lived in a shared yard situation where there were other parents with kids. A lot of people that choose the co-housing options are looking for that kind of options and having community, built-in community to help share for it. But you still have yard space, you still have trees. It's one of the wonderful things about I still can see birds outside my kitchen window. There's all these wonderful benefits to it. And it's these trade-offs that you talk about. I often say people are choosing to trade off space for place, that they're choosing the place they want to live in, or community they want to live on, and they can live on less space for that. And so I think you actually can have most of that. And the last thing is, again, less than 25% of the population is going to be, of the households, are going to be households with children. So we're talking about millennials that are having children later, baby boomers that don't have children in their house anymore. 75% of the population does not have children. And so all of those people that are living in detached single family homes that could move out of them, or people that don't have children yet, like all of these other people that don't need those single family homes. And here in California, I think we'd have to look at some things. I think Prop 13 is keeping people locked in their detached single family homes when they could be moving out and opening those up for families. I think there's a lot to it. But I think a lot of people are realizing that actually the detached single family home isn't the end all be all of the type of life they could live.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Karen, on so many of the different points. There's so many good segments I could ask you on questions, but I see an excellent related question in the chat, so I'll ask you that one.
Yeah.
So feel free to please leave any questions in the chat. I'll try to work them into the conversation as is fit, but there's some excellent observations in here too. But so you talked about how there's a 60% approval rating basically of this kind of housing. So there is a growing demand for it, and there is going to be even a need for it in the coming years. But how fast has missing middle housing been growing in the U.S. in recent years? And are you seeing, and are you personally or your company getting more attention on these kind of projects too? Is there is the demand being met essentially?
The demand is not being met, but we're working on that. That's what we're trying to do. So it is actually very difficult to build missing middle housing because it's illegal by zoning. I mean, the problem that we talked about. So we actually started raising attention to the issue. And in fact, that's when Dan came up with the name missing middle housing, because we have a history. We work on zoning reform. So he and I co-wrote a book over 12 years ago on zoning reform. And through that work on zoning reform, and that, our company, we're celebrating 20 years this year, which again, I can't believe. We started out talking about walkable neighborhoods. Our firm has always been about how do you build walkable neighborhoods. And as part of that, even walkable neighborhoods, not just missing middle housing, but most of walkable neighborhoods is actually illegal in zoning in the United States. And so we've been working on zoning reform for walkable neighborhoods for almost 20 years. And as part of that, this piece of the puzzle was a major piece of what current conventional zoning doesn't allow. And so, but changing zoning is hard. it's local. I mean, if you think about every 30,000 municipalities in the United States would have to update their zoning to allow this. So change is slow, it's hard, there's a lot of resistance to change. And so that's where the idea of coming up with a name and talking to people and reframing this conversation to make it easy for people to understand what we're talking about, to tell stories about it. People remember their grandmother. You know, my husband remembers going to visit his grandmother in the duplex in their small town in Nebraska, you know, reminding people about how wonderful these places are, but it is slow to change. And I think that's where I personally, having been on the front lines of this for a dozen years, am pretty excited about some of the statewide changes that are being enacted. I think that change is really hard and we need to push for that. But I also think we need to remember like how we can communicate with the communities that are resistant to this is by not scaring them, by talking to them about this is a place where their kids can come live who can't afford the detached single family home in their town, or this is a place where they can retire when they don't want to take care of a detached single family home anymore, and talk about how actually these are wonderful options in every community and how we change that. But it is slow and there are lots of barriers, and it's not just zoning. So zoning has to get changed. The financial models have to get changed. Not just the zoning, but the fees, some of the barriers, you know, sometimes one study we did, that same study in Nevada that I looked at, the fees were $35,000 per unit for an impact fee. Just straight off, the city was going to charge you $35,000 for every unit that you built. Mm-hmm. They were also, the utilities charge a $45,000 per unit hookup fee. So just those two fees alone, if the developer had the option to build a single family home, it was going to cost them $80,000. But if in the same envelope, they wanted to build 4 units so that it looked the same from the outside, but you're now housing 4 families, those units are more affordable because they're a fourth of the size. They're sharing the cost of the land by a fourth, but it was going to cost the developer $240,000 extra just for those 2 fees. Why would they bother? Right? It just doesn't make any sense. And that's just 2 fees. And what we're finding, I was reading a story today where one town in the South Bay, $200,000 per unit in fees that stacked up. Right. And that doesn't include the land costs for the length of the entitlement process. There's other issues. The condo liability construction defect laws are a problem. They're put in place for very, very good reasons. But the reality is that the risk of building something besides a detached single family home goes up because of that liability. And so I think looking at the construction defect laws in states that have them, and maybe revising them for buildings under 12 units or under 8 units, or under 4 units, right? Looking at those things. So parking is another big one, right? Some of the reasons, if you require 2 parking spaces per unit and you want to put a 4-plex in, you now have to fit 8 parking spaces on that piece of property, which is just impossible. It just won't work. It won't fit in these neighborhoods. So there's lots of barriers and change is slow, but the good news is we are getting a better handle on all those barriers. There are some great examples that are being built. Communities like the state of Oregon just passed the law that on any lot zoned detached single family home, you can build up to 3 units. You know, the city of Minneapolis is doing something similar. So I think there is hope, and we are seeing some change happen, but it's certainly slower than a lot of us would like to see.
Yeah, certainly so. And like you said it, I mean, in California alone, we have 58 counties, and then how many ever different municipalities and cities there are, all with their own different special rules about zoning and land use. And obviously, I believe there should be some local, flavor to your land use because it's the community that does it, right?
Yeah.
And I have all the conversations a lot with my city council members and folks I grew up with, because it is increasingly, and it is so important to do the grassroots work, the walking tours, the showing people what these options are, because even among young people, I would say, the options in our mind usually is, you either live in a high-rise, a glass kind of tower-looking thing,
yep,
or a single-family home that you maybe grew up in, right? There isn't a lot of options in the middle until you start moving around the country, maybe to older housing places that tend to be cheaper. You start realizing, things can look a little differently.
Yeah.
And I really do hope that we have more of these options. So going back to a point you said about it, being terribly slow, and since I will hopefully be joining the state legislature, working with YIMBYs across the state to make some changes, if you were to have an ideal state law change in which we change everything at one time in California to make sure there is more housing opportunities, what would that one ideal change be?
Oh, Well, the one ideal change, thank you. That was actually, that's a hard question if you were going to ask for like what's a full bill should look like, although I'd love to talk to you about that. But
Yeah.
but the one ideal change is absolutely well, I think the simplest change is to allow up to 4 units on any lot zoned detached single family. And you know, there are lots, again, there's lots of caveats around it. And but I think that's, to me, what I'm seeing is that's the simplest and most straightforward to start to allow change to happen. I think then local regulations need to look at how that works. And actually, I wanted to share, if I can share my screen again real quick, I wanted to show you all some picture about that. So one of the things that we also recommend that I talked about this before, that we recommend you zone for the envelope. And so we actually recommend getting rid of density and instead zoning width, depth, and height of the building. And part of the reason is because actually backyard space, still having some semi-private open space, is actually really important to livability as you increase the number of units and the number of people living in the building. And so often what happens when you allow 3 units, what we see happening in Oregon is they're actually building 3 detached single family homes just stacked up in front of each other on the lot. And so it's filling up the entire lot, which, number one, 3 detached single family homes isn't really helping the affordability problem very much, because part of it is these smaller units actually are providing a different size unit and a different cost price point. But also, when you have one lot that has 3 detached single family homes stacked to the back of the lot, it might be okay. But when you think about an entire block like that, all of a sudden you're building an interior of a block that has no open space, no access to air and light, and really is starting to create a pretty miserable experience. At the beginning, it doesn't seem like it, but when you start to see how this is going to change over time, it becomes a problem. And so for various reasons, we actually really recommend zoning this way, and then taking density out of it. So then you can have as many units as you want in it. And that's really important. And some of the other interesting things that are really fun is we really advocate against density-based zoning, because density means nothing. Because it means, like in this case, in this case, this is a fourplex, a study of a fourplex, and 4 units in one same size building on the top in the yellow, can have anywhere from 25 dwelling units to acre to 54 dwelling units per acre, depending on how big the lot is, right? It just doesn't, there's just no kind of zoning by density doesn't actually get you much. And it does actually create an incentive for developers to kind of max out whatever they can rather than building small units. So I think, to me, the simplest thing is number of units, but it does need to be paired with some education and some options for local municipalities to understand. In Oregon, they're actually looking at some baseline zoning frameworks for communities to be able to use so that they can actually have some control over what gets built and actually create delightful environments. And actually, Alex, that reminds me, one thing I wanted to mention was the COVID pandemic living.
Oh, yes.
And the idea of, here living in a pandemic, actually, my grandmother, my 92-year-old grandmother in Jacksonville, Florida, lives in a duplex, and she lives in a community that's mostly elderly people living, and some live in an assisted living facility, but she lives in a duplex. And so the people living in the assisted living facility, some of them have been locked in their rooms. Like, they're not allowed out because they can't go into a shared hallway and they can't go into a shared elevator, right? And so living in mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings, those shared spaces in a pandemic become really difficult. Whereas she lives in a duplex, so she has her own front door. So she's been able to go outside every day and go for a walk. And those sort of differences, or having some sort of outdoor space that's not a public park. So having a little bit of outdoor space where it's you and 4 families that are sharing a small outdoor space rather than needing to get to the public park. So these sort of things actually make a big difference during a pandemic, and they make a big difference in standard of living all of the time. And I think those are important things to remember.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I want to quickly point out, because there's a fantastic question in the chat. The chart you showed, or the illustration you just showed, I think is a great segue into talking about form-based zoning, because I think it's very typical that most people work in policy or you work in a housing advocacy, you hear about density all the time. But form-based zoning is something so, I think, amazing to be, just a lack of a better word, but could you explain briefly what form-based zoning is?
Sure.
And then also if there are any good examples, especially in the Bay Area, of any municipalities or governments that follow form-based zoning?
Yeah. So form-based coding is an alternative to conventional zoning. It's a zoning system. And essentially, instead of creating a zone that is single family, where if you think about the way most zoning is done, you draw a line on a map, and then the name of that map is based on the use. So you have R1, which is residential 1 unit, right? Or you have R2, which is residential 2 units, or you have C3, which is commercial. So by definition, you're defining areas in your city essentially by use first, which is separating uses. It's separating housing from commercial. And so if you think about a historic little market with the proprietor living above, or a doctor shop with the doctor living above, right? You have a commercial use on the ground floor and a residential use on the second floor. That's actually illegal in most zoning in the United States because it has to be separated. And the more you separate things, that's back from car-based planning where people could drive everywhere. And so they were so excited about the car, they said, we can go live in this garden suburb, and then we can drive to work, and then we can drive home. And now look what a nightmare it's created for so many people stuck for 2 hours in their car, right? So in looking at how you design integrated neighborhoods, use-based zoning is defined, conventional zoning is defined by use first. And then there are secondary factors that are form, but usually it's in the way of like a setback, where it says you have to put the building at least like 5 feet back from the sidewalk, but it can be anywhere past that, right? And so there's kind of like these minimums that they set, and there are all these other requirements like density and floor area ratio that are all these crazy numbers that, just like density I was showing you, don't actually do much for you, and they're not predictable. So what form-based coding does is it actually says what's the most important thing is the form of the building rather than the use, because the form of the building is what actually shapes our public space. And what we're talking about in zoning is protection of public health and safety. And so if you think about buildings as the walls of our public spaces, what matters most is how the form of that building shapes our public spaces. And what matters less is kind of what happens behind the front of those buildings. And so you think about creating a good street. And if it's a main street, you want the building up to the edge of the sidewalk to create a formed space. You want the shop fronts facing the street that are activated, so you have businesses there. If it's a neighborhood, you want to make sure you have a front door facing the street. And it might be 10 feet back from the sidewalk to have a small front yard because there's a row of front yards, right? Like there's these ways that the buildings face our public space that are important, as are the height of the buildings, the width of the buildings, and the depth of the buildings, as I talked about, as they affect kind of the back. And so form-based code says the first thing that's important is the form of the kind of place that we're creating and the form of the building. And that becomes the most important thing. And then it regulates other things. So use is still regulated, but it's often much less prescriptive. We saw one zoning code that actually had this list of uses that weren't allowed. And at the top of the list, it said Turkish bath, it said baths, Turkish. And at the bottom of the list, it said Turkish baths, because these lists of uses get so long and so crazy that nobody can keep track anymore. And we make it much more simpler. So the idea that kind of light industrial is often compatible with kind of the main street, and the residences, people are okay living above main streets and all of these things. So it's a little bit looser, but that actually what's important is how our buildings shape our public spaces. So that's where the form comes from. And then you regulate other things behind it. And so, yeah, so that's a start, and there's a whole book about it. Plenty more, yeah.
Yeah, like my district is overwhelmingly suburban, and a lot of folks get used to living in their detached single family home. But I always remind them when talking about things like this, all the housing options we have, a lot of folks spend, thousands of dollars to go to places that are more historically in line with the idea of form-based zoning. You take an expensive trip to Paris, and what you love about Paris is how it works that way, right? Yeah. Not because some planners in the 19th century said, we should just put everything far away from each other. You like it, and you want to spend time there because it works, right? And that's what we have in our communities.
Yeah. One other thing, Alex, can I just add one other thing?
Sure,
the other piece about form-based coding that's so important for communities is that they're predictable. So I mentioned the setback earlier. So conventional zoning often says the building has to be at least 5 feet back from the sidewalk, but then it can be anywhere else. So that means the community has no way of knowing what's going to get built, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same with FAR. So if you have an FAR of 1, it means you can have a single story building that covers the entire lot, Or you can have a 4-story building that covers a fourth of the lot, but that's all an FAR of 1. So there's no way for the community to know what's going to get built. Whereas a form-based code is very specific. Instead of a setback, we will often have a build-to line. The building has to get built here. Or in some historic neighborhoods, the building has to be built in line with the buildings on either side of it to create kind of the wall of the space. So whether that's 5 feet back or 10 feet back, or in some kind of more residential neighborhoods, it might say the building needs to be between 10 and 15 feet back from the sidewalk, but we'll rarely say anywhere beyond that, because what we're trying to do is create predictability so that when the zoning code is passed, the community can predict what's going to get built there. So the community can decide what they want, and then they can set rules so that what gets built meets what they are asking for. And the huge benefit of that is it actually takes away the need for the discretionary review process. The reason discretionary review was put in was because the community can't predict. So the community says, well, we don't know what you're going to build here, so we want to see it before we say it's okay for you to build it. Right. And that's understandable the way conventional zoning works. But with form-based codes, it's predictable. So the community can say, okay, we know the building's going to be here, and we know it's not going to be any taller than 2.5 stories. And we know it's not going to be any longer than 60 feet. So it's going to meet the majority of what we need. And therefore, we don't need to sign off on it. And we've actually had community members who will stand up and say, like, we are tired of discretionary review. It takes too much time. We don't have time to be reviewing every housing project that comes along. And the reality is it actually then saves money, because developers, then there's less risk. They know that as long as they follow the rules the community has set, that they're going to be allowed to build there. So they're able to build quicker. They have to carry the land cost for less time. There's not a chance that they're not going to get their permit, which happens all the time. And then that loss has to carry on to the next project because they weren't able to actually build on the land that they bought. So there's lots of reasons. And then there's the whole history of discretionary review being used as a racist tool to prevent people that they don't want to build. So there's all these wonderful reasons to write predictable zoning based on what the community has said they want. And then we can get rid of the discretionary review process, which has a lot of benefits.
Yeah, no, that is actually a great segue to 2 of the questions that got asked in the chat. But, yes, we hear that in the planning process all the time about how a building would fit within the character of the community, right? Whether or not that is their actual, first concern or not. Yeah. I think that is a way to relieve some of the uncertainty of it, right? If you know exactly how tall or what generally the dimensions of what the structure could be, rather than beefing about what the color of this building will be, how tall it will be. And you hear that all the time, right? Yeah. About how these things are. But I think on that topic, there are 2 great questions about this, which I'm going to distill into one is, I'm sure a lot of times you hear a lot of opposition or hesitancy from local officials or community members. What are some good strategies that you've employed to work through those challenges and get people more open-minded to these concepts?
Well, we do a lot of listening and making sure people feel heard, which is always, as you know, too, as a politician, it's really important. It's important that people actually really feel heard. And then it depends on where they're coming from. So there are communities that will talk about, no, we just want detached single family home. And so we start to talk about, well, where are you going to live when you can't take care of this home anymore, or don't want to take care of a home or a yard, right? And are you going to be able to stay in your community? Are there other options in your community of places where you're going to be able to live when you no longer want or can take care of a detached single family home? Or talk about their children. Where are your children going to live? Because there aren't places that they can afford in this community. And if you want your grandkids living nearby, then we better start building some other things. So really starting to talk to people about these options, talking to them about, taking the walking tours is super important. And actually, Alex, I'll help you find some neighborhoods in your area. Everywhere in the country, they exist examples, and I'm totally going to use your story about the politicians finding missing middle housing by having to go knock on the different doors. Usually we talk about counting mailboxes or counting electric boxes. Well, I think the politicians can knock on the doors. Yeah. So it makes it less scary because they're like, oh yeah, I love that part of the town. I would love to live in that area of town, right? Like reminding them that there's actually some great benefits to it. So, if that's their resistance, but if their resistance is this, like the other part of the resistance is the scary things that have been built in the past. And we talk about flipping the whole community process on its head. So right now the community process is very negative, right? The zoning isn't predictable. So developer comes in and wants to build something and they go put down money on a piece of land, and they're paying interest on that, and they go hire an architect and they design something and they bring it to the community, and the community is just complaining about all the things they don't like. So then the community, it just sets up this like headbutting process where the community is now complaining about all the things they don't like, and then the developer has to go back and spend a bunch more money to try to figure out what they're going to do, and then they bring it back, and it's just back and forth until the developer either runs out of money or the housing is super expensive. What we talk about is flipping that process on its head and starting by designing the community that you want to have. Like, what do you want to have in your community? If you want to have the neighborhoods that already exist, and that they maybe have a little bit of a front yard to them, and the buildings aren't too big, and maybe they can go to 2.5 stories to have a little attic kind of space in them, or how big do you want them to be? Or you want it to be a little Main Street area with some offices in the little houses behind it that transition into the neighborhood? Or do you want it to be your transit corridor, and you're allowing 4 and 5 and 6 story buildings along the corridor because it's a wide corridor and there's plenty of space, right? We can design these places, and we have examples of them, but we have to show pictures. We have to show pictures and show people what we're talking about. And so we often do a lot of diagramming in these community design processes that show, like the pictures we showed you for the North Berkeley BART station. Those are the types of things we would show, but we'll show variations, like how tall do you want it to be? How big do you want to allow the buildings to be? And then you write that into the coding. The buildings are allowed to be this big, they're allowed to be this wide, they're allowed to be this deep, they're allowed to be this high. You know, it's not rocket science. You just say, this is what we're going to allow. But what you're doing is you're writing into law what the community has actually designed and what the community has asked for. And when you add onto it like requirements for housing, so here in California, the RENA requirements for how much housing you have to build, and you start that process in the general plan process, you start to, but you have them really designed. This doesn't happen now. In the general plan process, people don't design, they just draw circles on a map and say, we're going to put the multifamily housing here, right? Instead, we actually design, like, what do these types of places look like? And then you put it in the general plan, and then you put it in zoning code. And then that gives people confidence. And developers actually love this, because all developers want to do is be able to design the building, get it built, and start getting rent or start selling it, right? So they really don't care so much what it is. And the developers will start picking the places where they can build what they want to build, and they love this. And so then they'll come in because they know the community has already approved this. The community is already on board with what you're asking for, and they can get their approvals and they can get it done quickly. And so some cities are actually doing this in order to attract the development that they need, because a lot of places can't get the developers.
Are there any good example cities you'd point to?
You know, in the Bay Area, let's see. So up in Hercules had one of the first form-based codes in the country, as a matter of fact. Some colleagues of ours designed it, and we actually worked to help implement it. And so the area down by the old dynamite plant, it's really actually wonderful. And if you ever take the Amtrak train to Sacramento, you pass right by it. And so that housing area was designed using a form-based code. The Pleasant Hill BART station area was designed using a form-based code. And that's a great story, because when they started that process, the community was so up in arms about what was going to happen with that BART lot that they had to hire armed guards to come to the community process. And within 7 days of this design project, the project got unanimous approval. And we now have this wonderful project, the Pleasant Hill BART station, that was built. So that was done with a form-based code. So yeah, it's a great story of how community design can bring people together. When you start actually drawing things, it really makes a difference.
Yeah, I think innately land use and architecture are a visual language, and it's very hard to sometimes decipher and pit these things out when you make it so vague or you put it by words. So really illustrating it is a big example. I do want to be cognizant of time, because we're supposed to slay it at 8:30, but I do see some really great questions in there. So if we want to quickly do a couple last ones, is that all right, Karen?
Speed round, let's go.
This is a difficult one, but I think it's an interesting good one if you can answer briefly. But someone in the chat said, and I'll just read this one as verbatim because I think it is an interesting, different challenge. They said, one things that East Bay for Everyone is struggling with in Oakland is high land value that makes redevelopment of single family homes into fourplexes infeasible. So what can we do around development standards to make those feasible? And he said, speaking about Rockridge mostly. And I know this is a very dense topic, and we could talk about all these things for hours, but I do want to, I think this is important to kind of at least address a little bit.
Yeah. You know, it's a difficult one. And I think, you know, anything the community can do to make it simpler to rebuild, to make entitlements quicker, that they don't have to do any dividing of the land, that more units are allowed. We actually encourage communities to go out and start working with their local banks and finding financing mechanisms to make this simpler. But it isn't going to work everywhere. And I think particularly in some areas of the Bay Area, the land cost is just so high right now, and construction costs are high, labor is high, land costs are high. It is going to be difficult to pull off. So we are still looking and trying to figure out some of that. But I will say there are going to be some areas where for a while it's just not going to pencil out. But so for that reason, anything that you can do in the community to get rid of any costs that's going to make this simpler, make the process quicker, to make it easier for small developers, right? Large developers are not generally going to come do this unless they're doing a big project like the whole neighborhood we're doing outside Omaha, or the car-free community we're doing in Mesa, where there's big projects of land. If we're talking about existing neighborhoods like Rock Ridge, where there are already homes on the property and high values, it's going to be small. These are going to be small developers, homeowners that are doing it. So we have to make the process super simple, super easy financing. And I tend to think making things easier, like stacking a unit. I think of a lot of single family, single story bungalows that exist in the East Bay. And if you add a second unit, identical unit on top that makes a stacked duplex, and an ADU in the back, you've gone from 1 unit to 3 units, actually fairly simply, rather than trying to tear down something and build a fourplex on it. But so yeah, it's not going to be easy in areas like that, but it's certainly worth continuing to try for.
Yeah, always worth the try. Well, okay, I would be a terrible host if I didn't ask this last question, because for the namesake of the event. But we talked a lot about contrasting missing middle housing to single family housing. What do you would say are the advantages to, say, the very tall type of skyscraper buildings that missing middle has?
Well, a couple of things. The reality is resistance is a big deal. Community resistance, we all know it. Politicians, we see this. It's the reason a lot of the housing bills in California haven't been able to get passed, because there are communities that are just adamant about not being tall, mid-rise and high-rise buildings. And not everyone needs to live there. The reality is the density that we do provide by having missing middle housing is plenty to be responsible use of our land. And to provide, I think another aspect of it is livable living. Like, not everyone wants to live in a mid-rise or high-rise apartment building. I love having the tree right outside my kitchen window. It makes doing dishes so much more pleasant when I'm watching the hummingbirds outside the window. And I know it's cliche, but especially now in the pandemic, it makes a huge difference to quality of life to have open space, to live in a low-rise neighborhood with tree-lined streets. And so towers are not the solution for everyone. They are a solution for a lot of people, and they're wonderful to have as part of the kit of parts of housing parts. But there's a lot of different ways to live and a lot of benefits to living in low-rise neighborhoods. And if we want to make progress on the over 75% of California that's zoned detached single family, we need to have options other than towers, because not every community is going to allow towers in.
Yeah, exactly. And to note, though, a lot of opposition to towers is, at least on its face, a form-based opposition. So, which is very interesting, right? There are so many great topics we could have dived into. I know we don't have, we're running out short on time, and there's so many great topics, but I know the organizers will post this later on and have more questions, but I know there's more ways to find out. So without going super over time on all the great issues that I want to talk about with you, Karen, I want to kick it back to Zach just on the final things to wrap up the event. So thank you so much, Karen.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alex. It was fun.
Thank you so much. That was great. And yeah, like Alex mentioned, we will be posting this online later this week. Urban Environmentalists has a YouTube channel. We also want to leave you with a few reminders. So I think Derek is going to add this to the chat. So Alex Lee is running as a Democrat for State Assembly, District 25. And you can find out more about his campaign at votealexlee.com. And Karen's partner, Dan Parolek, recently published a book on these themes, Missing Middle Housing, available from Island Press. Urban Environmentalists is one of the sponsors of the event. Our mission is to address the climate and inequality crises by transforming cities and towns into inclusive communities designed around people rather than cars. You can join us at urbanenvironmentalists.org/join. South Bay YIMBY is the second co-host. South Bay YIMBY supports plentiful, inclusive, and affordable housing in the South Bay. They aim to provide evidence-based solutions to the housing crisis and a political voice to residents struggling to avoid housing. They want to ensure that everyone has the opportunity and ability to live and work in the Bay Area. Visit at southbayyimby.wordpress.com. And finally, East Bay for Everyone is the final co-host. They're a network of voices speaking up for housing abundance and better cities all over the East Bay. Support them at eastbayforeveryone.org/join. All right, so that's it. I want to thank everyone for coming, and don't forget to look for some pro-housing ballot guides online, and make sure to vote. We'll see you at the next event.